My husband hired a woman out of a dust storm and put her in the back room, and inside of 1 week, she knew where my well was, what color the north room had been papered before I ever came to that house, and which board on my porch cried out when you stepped on it. She had lived under that roof before I laid eyes on it. She had lived in it as a wife. I was 47 years old that fall, and I had been married to Wendell Prather for 26 years, and it turned out I had never been married to him at all. There was a paper in a courthouse 90 miles from my kitchen that said so. There was another one, sworn out in my husband's own hand in 1909, that said the woman drinking coffee at my table had been dead for 26 years. And there was a page in my own family Bible, written in ink that did not match the ink above it, that told me what he had really done. And it was worse than the other two put together. I had raised a child for 25 years, and I had thanked that man for him every day of it. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. It always amazes me how far these stories travel, and I read every single one. Now settle in, because this took me from the spring of 1935 to the first Monday in November of that same year, and there is not a part of it I have been able to put down since. I want to start with the dust, because if you did not live through it, you will hear the rest of this wrong. By 1935, out on the flats above the Cimarron in the Oklahoma Panhandle, dust was not weather. Weather comes and goes, and you get on with your work. Dust was a thing that lived with us. It came in the window sash, and the door frame, and the keyhole, and up through the floor. And it came through a wet sheet nailed over the window, and it lay in a fine gray line along the top of every picture frame in my front room by 9 o'clock in the morning, no matter what I had done at 8. I set my table upside down. You would not know that unless you had done it. I set the plates and the cups face down on the cloth and turned them over one at a time as I filled them, and my mother-in-law had done the same before me, and every woman on that road did it, and there was no shame in it. It was just how you kept a mouthful of grit off your husband's supper. We had 480 acres, and a half section of it had come from Wendell's father, and the quarter west of the house had come, I was told, from a piece of money that Wendell had put together on his own before we married. I never had any reason to think another thing about it for 26 years. That quarter had the windmill on it and the good pasture, back when there was such a thing as pasture. By that spring, we had 11 head left of 140. The government had bought most of the rest the year before under the drought program. $16 a head for the ones fit to ship, and a few dollars for the ones that were not, and the ones that were not were shot in a trench a mile from my kitchen door. I do not intend to describe that. I will say only that my husband walked out there and stood with his hat off and came back and did not eat supper. And that was the only time in 26 years I saw Wendell Prather refuse food. We had our home place, our windmill, our chickens, and our name at the store. And we had our children, and I will tell you about them now, because everything that happened turns on the older one. Loyal was 25. He had gone to California in the fall of 34, which I did not want and could not argue against, because there was nothing on that place for a young man but wind. He wrote once a month, and he sent $10 in the letter when he had it, and it came in a money order that my hand shook to hold. He was a big-boned, slow-talking boy, and he had a way of going quiet in a room that made me anxious when he was small, and he had one crooked little finger on his left hand that would not lie straight. He caught it in a hay pulley when he was 7, was what we always said. Desi was 19, and she was at home with me, and she had her father's flat calm and my mouth, which is a hard combination in a girl in a house where nothing was going right. She wanted to go to the teacher's college at Alva. There was no money for the teacher's college at Alva. She had a box under her bed with $4.40 in it that she was not aware I knew about. And there had been another boy. I want him in this story because he belongs in it. My first was born in the June of 1910, and he was born dead, and I was 3 weeks in a bed with the fever afterward, and there was a good stretch of that I have never gotten back. His name was going to be Ellis. Dr. Sable came out from Verlin on a horse, and he was 51 hours in my house, and he told me at the end of it that I would very likely not carry another one. And he was wrong about that twice, thank God. But he was right that I would never be the same about the month of June. That is the family. Now I will tell you about the 14th of April, 1935, which is a date you may have heard called Black Sunday, and which in my house was the day the woman came. It had been a fine morning. I want that understood, because it is what made that day famous. It was the first warm, still Sunday of the year, and the sky was washed clean, and people all over 3 states went out and did things they had not done in a year. We took the truck to church in Verlin, and afterward, Desi and I sat on the running board and ate a cold biscuit apiece in the sun, with our sleeves pushed up. And Hattie Coombs came over from the post office side of the store and stood with us and said, "Well, girls, maybe that is the end of it. Maybe we are through the worst." At about 4 in the afternoon, the birds went over. That is what I remember before anything else. Every bird in the panhandle came over our place going south, low and quick and not making a sound. And I stood in my yard with a dish towel in my hand and watched them go. And Cleve Dorn came out of the barn and stood beside me, and neither one of us said anything at all. Then the north went black. I have heard people try to describe it, and they always reach for a cloud, and it was not a cloud. It was a wall. It stood up off the ground a good 2,000 feet, and it came on rolling over itself like water in a ditch. And it was the color of a chimney inside, and there was no wind out in front of it at all, which was the terrible part. The stillness ran ahead of it. Cleve said, in an ordinary voice, "Get the girl in the house, Miss Prather." I got Desi in the house. Wendell was out at the west fence, and I saw him coming at a run with his hat in his hand. And I stood in that door until he made the yard, and then the light went. Not dimmed, went. It was 4 in the afternoon, and I could not see my own hand held up in front of my face, and the dust came under the door in a wave you could feel across your ankles, and Desi got the lamp lit, and it made a little brown ball of light about the size of a grapefruit and no more. We sat in that dark with wet rags on our faces for the better part of 2 hours. The static came up so bad, the barbed wire out the window was showing blue at the posts, and Cleve had run a chain from the truck to the ground so the engine would not shock a man senseless. You could not touch another person without a spark that would make you jump. Wendell sat with his back against the door and his hands on his knees, and he did not say one word the whole time. And Desi put her head in my lap, and I held the rag on her face and thought about the lungs of a 19-year-old girl. And a little after 6, when it had gone from black to a kind of brown twilight and you could see the shape of the barn, somebody knocked on my door. Now I want you to understand what that meant. Nobody was out. Nobody in 3 counties was out. The road was drifted over, and a car would have been off in the bar ditch inside of 100 yards, and no living soul had any business walking on that road that day. Wendell got up off the floor and opened the door. There was a woman standing on my porch. She had a wet flour sack tied over her face, and her coat was gray with it, and her hair was gray with it. And there was a suitcase set down beside her, a real one, leather with a strap, and it was so covered you could not tell the color. She untied the sack, and she was breathing bad, and her eyes were red as a rabbit's from the grit. And she looked past my husband, straight into my kitchen, and she did not look at the stove or the table or my daughter. She looked up at the ceiling over the door, where there is a place the plaster went bad in 1922 and got patched with a square of tin. She looked at that square of tin like a woman looking at a face. Then she said, and her voice was a ruin from the dust, she said, "I am sorry to trouble you. I am asking for work. I will take my meals and a place out of the wind and no wages until you can see what I am worth." And my husband said nothing. I have gone back to that moment 1,000 times, and I want to be exact about it, because it is the only warning I got, and I did not take it. Wendell Prather stood in the door of his own house with his hand on the frame, and he did not say a word. He did not say, "We have got no work." He did not say, "Come in out of it." He stood there long enough that I got up from the floor and came around him and said, "For mercy's sake, get her inside." And I took that woman by the arm myself and brought her into my kitchen and set her in my chair and got the kettle over. Her name, she said, was Vesta Hoyle. She was 44 years old, though I would have said older that night, and she had a long, straight back and a way of sitting with her hands still in her lap that I have never in my life been able to manage. Her face was thin, and the bones showed, and she had been handsome. She drank 2 cups of water and then a cup of coffee, and she thanked me for each one separately. And when Desi brought her a clean cloth, she took the girl's hand for a second while she took it. Just held her hand a second longer than you would. She said she had come up from Amarillo. She said she had been keeping house for a family that had gone back to Arkansas and had left her with a month's wages and no place. She said she could cook and put up fruit and doctor a sick animal, and that she was not afraid of a field. She said all of it plain, without whining, and without that bright, fake cheer that people had gotten in the habit of using in those years. And I liked her. I want that on the record, too. I sat in my kitchen on the 14th of April, and I liked that woman. And there is a piece of me that still does, and that is the hardest thing in this whole account to say out loud. Wendell had not spoken. He had put his hat back on in the house, which he never did, and he was standing at the window with his back to us, looking out at nothing, at a brown dark you could not see 10 feet into. I said, "Wendell, we could give her the back room." And my husband said, in a voice with nothing in it, "Whatever you think, Alma." That is the second thing I have gone over 10,000 times. Whatever you think, Alma. 26 years, and I could count on one hand the decisions that man had left to me, and he left me that one. He put it in my hands, and I picked it up, and for the rest of my life I have known that I carried her into my own house myself. He never had to lift a finger. That is how the whole thing was done, from the start to the finish. He never had to lift a finger, because there was always somebody standing by, ready to do it for him, out of the goodness of her heart. She stayed. She slept in the back room, which had been Loyal's, and in the morning she was up before me with the stove going and the coffee made, and she had swept out the porch, and she had put the broom back on the nail behind the door. I had never in my life told anybody that the broom went on the nail behind the door. There is no reason on this earth for a stranger to hang a broom there. There is a hook by the stove that any sensible person would use, and my mother-in-law had put a nail behind that door in 1906 because the broom by the stove got soot on it, and I have hung my broom on that nail every day of my married life without ever once thinking about it. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen at 5:30 in the morning and looked at that broom hanging on that nail, and something went through me from the back of my neck to my heels, and I did not have a name for it. I said, "Well, you are an early riser." And Vesta Hoyle turned around from my stove with my coffee pot in her hand and said, "I always have been." And then she said, "I hope you take it strong." I take it strong. Wendell takes it weak with a lot of milk, and she poured his that way an hour later without asking him and set it down at his right hand, and my husband looked at that cup for a long moment before he picked it up. She was the best hand I ever had in that house, and I have thought a great deal about whether that was a kindness or a strategy, and I have decided it was neither. She simply knew the work, the way you know a hymn you have not sung in 30 years. Inside of 2 weeks, the place ran different. My yard got swept twice a day. The chickens, which had gone off laying with the dust the way they did, came back to 7 and 8 eggs a day. And when I asked her what she had done, she said she had moved the water where it was out of the wind and had been giving them the grit off the drift by the fence, which is exactly the sort of thing that no one who has not done it would ever think of. She put up wild plum in June, out of the draw down at the section line, a place I had not been in 2 years because I did not know there was still anything down there worth walking for. She could cut a man's shirt out of 2 feed sacks with almost nothing left over. She could go out to a heifer at midnight with a lantern and come back at 2 in the morning with her sleeves down and say only, "She will do now." And she was easy in the house. That is the part I would not have predicted. A stranger in a small house is a weight on everybody, and Vesta Hoyle was not. She talked when there was talking, and she was quiet when there was not, and she never once in 7 months asked me a question about my own business. That is worth stopping on, and I did not stop on it at the time. Think of every woman you ever took in for a week. They ask, "Where do your people come from? How long have you been out here? Is that your boy in the picture? What does your husband think about the wheat?" It is how a person makes a place for herself in a house that is not hers. Vesta Hoyle never asked me one single thing. She already knew. I am going to lay out for you now the things that woman knew, in the order I noticed them, and I want you to see that not one of them, by itself, would have made you get up out of your chair. The broom on the nail behind the door. That was the first, and I told you about it. The well. We have 2 waters on that place, the cistern by the house that catches off the roof, and the old dug well out past the smokehouse with a rock curb on it that my husband's father put down in 1898. By 1935, nobody used the old well much because it was 110 steps from my kitchen and the water was hard as a rock. In the last week of April, I came out with the wash water, and Vesta Hoyle was coming up from the smokehouse with 2 full buckets off that old well. And she said, over her shoulder, "The cistern will taste like the roof by August. You want the old well for drinking from here on." She was right, and I had known that all my life, and nobody had told her. The north room. The end of May, hot, and we were turning out the 2 back rooms, and she stood in the doorway of the north one with a bucket in her hand and looked at the walls, which are painted over now, and are and always have been since I have known them, a plain buff. And she said, half to herself, "They papered it." It was a blue paper with a vine in it, and it went bad along the chimney within 2 winters. I said, "What?" And she said, without any hurry at all, "Some of these old houses were papered before the war. You find it under the paint sometimes." There was blue paper with a vine in it under that paint. I know because in 1938, when everything else in this story was long over, I took a knife to a corner of that wall, behind where the bed had been, and I sat on the floor of that room and looked at it for a long time. The porch board, the third one from the step, cries. Not creaks, cries. A high sound like a cat, and it has done it since Wendell's father built the porch. And every soul who has ever lived in that house steps over it without knowing they do. Vesta stepped over it from the first morning. Nobody steps over it the first morning. Desi's own beau, who had been coming to that porch for a year and a half, hit that board every single time and jumped every single time. The storm cellar. This one I did not see myself, Desi told me, and Desi told me in a voice that was pleased, the way a girl is pleased when she has found somebody clever. There was a duster the last week of May, not a bad one, and Desi was going out to the cellar with the lamp, and the cellar door had drifted over the way it does, and she said Vesta walked straight out into that brown dark, in blowing dirt, without a lantern, put her hand down on the sand, and started digging in the right spot the first time. The peach tree. There is a stump out past the chicken house, about the size of a dinner plate. In the middle of June, Vesta Hoyle stood in the yard drying her hands and said, "That was a peach tree, and it never made anything but hard little green things, and everybody said cut it down." Now that stump was there when I came to that house in 1909. I had asked my mother-in-law about it once, and she had said it was a peach that had never done a thing, and Wendell's father had taken it out the year before I came. The year before I came. I stood in my own yard on a hot morning in June, with my hands in my apron, and I looked at the back of that woman's head, and the thought came up in me for the first time, and I put it down again, and I will tell you exactly what I said to myself, because I have heard 100 women say some version of it since. I said, "There is a reasonable explanation, and I am too tired to go looking for it, and I have got a wash to hang." I had a wash to hang. That is what I had. Wendell changed that spring, and it went the other direction from what you would expect, which is why it fooled me. He did not get short with me. He did not go quiet in the way that men go quiet when they are hiding a woman. He got careful. He got so careful with me that it felt for a few weeks like something sweet. He noticed when I had been on my feet all day, and he told me to sit down. He brought me a bottle of good vanilla from the store in Verlin at a time when we were counting nickels, and he set it on the table and did not look at me while I opened it. He started saying my name at the ends of sentences, which he had never done in his life. "That is fine, Alma. I will see to it, Alma." And he stopped being in a room with her. He took his dinner to the field. He had never done that in 26 years, not once, not in harvest. He came in at noon and washed at the basin on the porch and took his plate out to the truck and ate it in the shade of the truck, alone, 300 feet from his own kitchen, all through May and June and July. If Vesta was in the kitchen, he was in the barn. If she came to the barn with the eggs, he was suddenly out at the tank. In 7 months, I never once saw the two of them stand in a room together for longer than it takes to set down a plate. And the strangest part is that it was not awkward. They were not stiff. They moved around each other like two people who had done it before. I did catch them together twice, and I want to tell you about both times because they were not what you are thinking. The first was in the first week of June, in the evening. I came around the corner of the house with the egg basket, and they were at the tank, and he had his hands on the pump rod, and she was standing about 8 feet off with her arms folded, and they were not talking. They were just standing. And when I came around the corner, neither one of them jumped. They both looked at me at the same time, easy, the way you look up when the wind changes, and Wendell said, "The leather is gone again," and went back to it. I have known guilty people. Guilty people jump. Those two had the calm of a thing that had been settled a long time ago. The second was in August. I got up at about 2 in the morning for the water, and there was a lamp turned low in the kitchen, and my husband was sitting at the table with his hands flat on it, and Vesta Hoyle was standing at the stove with her back to him, not doing anything, just standing at the stove. And I stood in the dark of the hall in my nightdress, and I heard her say, in a voice too low for the room, "You know what I came for." And my husband said, "Not yet." That is every word I heard. I went back to my bed and I lay there until the sky went gray, and in the morning she gave me the eggs and asked whether I wanted the beans strung, and I said yes, and we strung beans on the porch for an hour and a half and talked about the price of shoe leather. You want to know why I did not say anything? I have asked myself for years, and the answer is not a good one, but it is the true one, and I have decided to put the true one in. I thought she was his woman. There. That is what I thought. I thought my husband had a woman he had known before, from Amarillo or from wherever, and that she had come up out of a bad year with no place to go, and that he had let her stay out of some old debt or some old feeling, and that the two of them had settled it between them that nothing more would happen under my roof. I thought, in my own kitchen, over my own beans, that my husband had a past and a conscience, and that I was watching him pay for one with the other. And I decided to wait him out. I decided that in the fall she would go, and that we would never speak of it, and that I would have my house back. 26 years of marriage will teach a woman to wait a thing out. It is the single most useful skill I ever had, and it nearly cost me everything I owned. Because I was wrong. She was not his woman. She was his wife. Desi loved her, and I want to be fair about that too, because it made everything harder later. That girl had been raised on a place with no other woman on it but her mother. And here came somebody who could do everything her mother could do and did it differently, which at 19 is the same as doing it better. Vesta showed her how to lay a pattern on the bias so a feed sack dress hung right. Vesta could recite whole pieces of poetry into a dishpan, and Desi thought that was the finest thing she had ever heard. And I will admit to you here, 30 years later, that it stung. Vesta got her talking about the teacher's college at Alva and told her, in front of me, that a girl with a hand as neat as hers ought not to be feeding chickens at 30. And Desi looked at me across that kitchen with her whole face lit up, waiting for me to say something. I said the beans were going to scorch. And Vesta asked about Loyal. Not much. Never in a way you could point to. There is a photograph on my front room shelf of my son at 17, standing beside the truck with his sleeves rolled. And in the second week she was in my house, I came in and found her holding it. Just standing in the middle of my front room, holding it in both hands. She put it back and said, "He has got a good face. Is he your only boy?" I said he was, and I said the other things a mother says, that he was in California in the vegetables around Bakersfield, that he wrote once a month, that he sent $10 when he had it. And Vesta Hoyle said, "Does he write in his own hand, or does somebody write for him?" That is a strange question. I want you to sit with how strange that question is. I did not sit with it at the time. I said, "He writes his own. He has a fine hand, better than his father's." And she nodded, and she picked up the dish towel, and she said, "That is a good thing in a boy." But she asked me 2 more things about him over the next month, and both of them were the same kind of strange, and I answered both without a thought. She asked whether he had ever had a trouble with his ears when he was small. And she asked in July, with her back to me at the stove, whether he had been a big baby or a little one. I said he had been small. I said he had been the smallest baby anybody in that country had ever seen live. And Vesta Hoyle stood at my stove with her back to me and did not say one word. And after a while, she moved the pan off the fire, and if I had walked around that woman and looked at her face in that minute, this would be a different story and a shorter one. Church was where the town got hold of it, and the town got hold of it in the way towns do, which is sideways. We went into Verlin on a Sunday in the first week of July, all 4 of us in the truck, and Vesta sat in the back with Desi and got down at the church and went in and sat in the 4th row on the left with her hands in her lap. Reverend Pearl preached on Naomi and the daughter-in-law who would not go back, which is a thing I have never been able to sit through since without a sour taste, and afterward, on the steps, the women came at me the way they do. "Who is she? Where did you get her? What are you paying her? Is that wise?" And Hattie Coombs, who ran the post office window in the corner of the store and who had been in that country since before statehood, stood off to the side with her purse in front of her and looked at Vesta Hoyle for a long moment, and then she said, to nobody in particular, "Hoyle." I said, "That is right, Vesta Hoyle. She came up from Amarillo." And Hattie said, "There were Hoyles on the Cimarron before the war, down where the Nash place is now. There was a Dutch Hoyle, had a section and a half, and he lost it in 1911. I said something about how it was a common enough name. Hattie Coombs looked at me over the top of her glasses in the way that woman had, which was the way a person looks at you when they have decided to let you alone for the present, and she said, "It is not, though, not around here." And that night, in the truck going home, with the sun down and the dust standing in the headlights, I looked in the mirror at Vesta Hoyle sitting in the back of my husband's truck with her hands in her lap, and she was looking out at that country going by, and she was crying without making any sound at all, not covering her face, not wiping it, just sitting up straight in the back of a truck at twilight with the tears going down into her collar, looking at a country she had told me she had never seen before in her life. The money came out in August, and it came out at a post office window in the corner of a store from a woman who thought she was making conversation. I had gone into Verlin on my own on a Thursday because the wheat allotment check was due, and because I had $11 of egg money and a list. Hattie Coombs was at the window with her sleeve protectors on, and she got the check out of the drawer and licked her thumb and pushed it across at me and said, "Well, that will help." And then she said, and I want you to know she said it kindly, with no more weight in it than a remark about the heat. She said, "Tell Wendell his order went out Tuesday, same as always, but if he wants it to catch the 1st of the month, he had better bring it Monday, because they have changed the pickup at Guyman." I said, "His order." Hattie said, "The money order." And then she looked at me, and I saw her go still behind her glasses, and she began, very carefully, to be a woman who had said too much and had decided to be useful about it instead of sorry. She said, "Alma, honey, he sends one the last week of every month." I said, "To who?" And Hattie Coombs said, "Enid. It goes to a box in Enid. It has gone to a box in Enid since I have had this window, and Nettie had this window before me. And I have got a stamp book that will say it back to 19 and 22, and I would not swear it did not go on before that. Now here is what I had been told for 26 years, and had never once had a reason to doubt. The quarter west of the house, the one with the windmill, carried a note. Wendell had taken it before we married from the Federal Land Bank in Wichita, and he paid on it out of the crop. And in the bad years, he paid on it out of whatever there was. And every month or so for my whole married life, that man had told me some version of the same thing at the kitchen table, which was that the note was seen to, that it was tight, but it was seen to, and that I was not to worry about the note. He had said it so many times that the words had worn smooth. I was not to worry about the note. I stood at that post office window in a store that smelled of coal oil and new denim, and I said, in a voice that sounded to me like it was coming from over by the shoe rack, "How much?" And Hattie said, $12. It has been $12 for as long as I can remember. It was 15 in the good years. $12 in 1935 in Sawyer County, Oklahoma. My daughter had $4.40 in a box under her bed that she had been 3 years putting together and that she thought was a secret. And my husband had been sending $12 a month to a post office box in Enid since before that girl was born. I did not cry in the store. I want that written down because it is one of about 2 things from that whole summer I am proud of. I put the check in my pocketbook and I bought my coffee and my thread and a can of lye, and I asked after Hattie's sister who had the shingles, and I got in the truck and I got about 2 miles out on the section road before I had to pull off, and I sat there in a truck cab at 101 degrees with my hands on the wheel, and what I felt was not grief, and it was not even anger yet. It was the floor going out. It was the exact feeling of putting your foot down on a stair that is not there. I went to the bank on the way back in. I did not plan it. I turned the truck around on that section road and drove back into town and went up the steps of the Verlin State Bank. And Otho Renfrew came out from behind the rail with his hand out and his sleeves gartered. And I said, "Mr. Renfrew, I want to know where we stand on the note on the West Quarter." He took me back to his desk and sat me down and was very kind about it, in the way of a man who has been kind to a great many women in that chair that year and has gotten good at it. He got a folder, he put on his glasses, and he said, "Mrs. Prather, I am going to be straight with you because you asked me straight. There has not been a payment on that note since the September of 1933. I said, "That is not possible." And he said, "It is possible, and it has got a date on the first Monday in November, and I have been telling your husband since April. 23 months of nothing on the note. 23 payments of $12 gone to a box in Enid. I want to say one thing here to any woman listening who has ever been told not to worry about the note. If a man will not show you the paper is not what he says it is. It does not matter how good he is. It does not matter that he has never raised his voice at you in his life. My husband never raised his voice at me one time in 26 years, and I have come to understand that a man who never has to raise his voice has usually found some other way to get what he wants." I said nothing to Wendell that night. I want to explain why, because it was not cowardice, or it was not only cowardice. It was that I had 2 pieces in my hand, the money and the woman. and I could feel with my whole body that they went together. And I knew that if I put them down in front of that man before I understood the shape of them, he would give me an answer that fit both, and I would take it, because I had been taking his answers for 26 years, and I was good at it. I needed one more piece. I needed something he could not talk over. I got it 3 days later from a 63-year-old hired man leaning on a fence. Cleve Dorn had been with us since 28. He slept in the bunk room off the barn, and he ate at my table, and he had exactly one topic, which was the weather in years past. And he could tell you what the wind had done in any month of any year since before the war. He was mending the corner brace at the corral, and I brought him a jar of water, and we stood there and looked at 11 head of cattle in a lot that used to hold 140, and Cleve said, out of nothing at all, "Miss Prather, I have been trying for a month to place that woman, and it come to me Tuesday night." I said, "Place her how?" And he said, "I hauled the tank and the drill rig out here for the Prathers in the fall of 1908. Before I ever worked for anybody in this country, I hauled for the drilling outfit out of Woodward, and we come out here to put down the deep well, and I was 17 years old, and I sat on that porch and drank buttermilk." He turned the jar around in his hands. "And there was a young woman on that porch, and it was not you." I said, "Cleve." He said, "I know it. I have sat on it a month. It might not be her. It has been 26 years and I was 17, and there is a good deal of country between." I said, "What did she look like?" And Cleve Dorn said, "She was tall, and she sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight up like a fence post. And she had a way of thanking you for a thing twice, once when you done it and once when you left. That is the woman. That is exactly the woman." And Cleve Dorn had put his finger on the two things about Vesta Hoyle that anybody who spent a week in a house with her would notice. And then he said the thing that finished me for the day. He said, "I asked the driller when we was pulling out, I said, 'Who was that?' And he said, 'That is the Hoyle girl that the young Prather married. Her daddy is down on the Cimarron.' And I said, 'Well, she is a handsome woman,' I said in a voice I did not recognize. 'When did you say that was?' And Cleve said, 'October of 1908, ma'am.' I know it was October because we come in on the tail of the Woodward job, and I was 2 weeks off my birthday. I was married in the September of 1909. I came to that house as a bride in the last week of September 1909, and I have got a photograph of myself standing on that porch in a dress with a high collar to prove it. A year before that photograph was taken, there was a woman sitting on my porch with her back straight up, thanking a boy twice for a load of pipe. I did not sleep that night, and I did not sleep well again for a good long while. And the next morning I got up and made breakfast for 4 people and hung out a wash, because that is what there is to do. Now I have to tell about Desi and the dust, because it came right in the middle of all this, and because it is the reason I did not move for 2 weeks. The 11th of September there was a bad one, a red one out of the southwest that ran 3 days on and off, and my daughter took it in the chest. Dust pneumonia was not a thing anybody had a name for until about 1934, and then everybody had a name for it, and everybody in that country had seen a child or an old man go down with it, and had seen some of them not come back up. Desi ran a fever of 103 for 2 days, and coughed until there was blood in the rag, and there was mud, actual mud, in the corners of her mouth in the morning, where she had breathed the room. Dr. Sable came out from Verlin on the 2nd day. He was 71 years old by then, and he had been coming out to that house since before I lived in it. And he sat on the edge of my daughter's bed and listened to her chest for a long time. And then he sat in my kitchen and drank a cup of coffee and told me to keep wet sheets over both windows and to keep her flat and to give her the steam, and that she was strong, and it was in the upper lobe, and he had seen a great deal worse. And on his way out to his car, he stopped in my yard and looked back at my house and said, "Is that woman staying on with you?" I said she was. And Dr. Sable said, That is all he said. And he got in his car and drove out, and it was 2 months before I understood that the oldest man in that county had recognized a face and had decided, in the yard of a house with a sick girl in it, that it was not the day. Vesta Hoyle nursed my daughter for 9 days. I have to put that in. She did the nights. I did the days, and she did the nights. And she did them the way you do them when you have done them before, with the steam kettle at the right distance and the pillows built up in a way I had not thought of. And on the 3rd night, when the fever broke and Desi came out of it soaked through and shaking, it was Vesta who got her changed and dry, and it was Vesta who sat thereafter and sang, low, some old thing about a river, over and over, for about an hour and a half. I stood in the hall in the dark, outside my daughter's room, and listened to a woman I was 3 days from being afraid of sing my child to sleep. And I want anybody who is listening to this and thinking, well, I would have thrown her out by then, to understand what a house is really like. It is not a court of law. It is a kitchen and a sick room and a wash line. And the woman who is holding up her end of it at 4 in the morning is not the woman you can throw out at 8. When Desi was up and taking soup, I did 2 things. The first is that I went into the front room while everybody was out and took down the family Bible from the shelf and opened it to the page in the front where the births are written. And I read that page for the first time in about 15 years. It was all there in my husband's father's hand, and then in Wendell's hand, all of it. The marriages and the deaths and the births. My name, my stillborn Ellis in the June of 1910. My Loyal, my Desi. It was as familiar as my own hand, and I read it, and nothing about it looked wrong to me at all, and I put it back on the shelf. Hold on to that. I read that page in September and saw nothing. The second thing I did was ask my husband about the money, and I picked my moment badly, and I have never once regretted it because of what it made him do. It was a Sunday evening, and we were on the porch, and the sun was going down the color of a rusty nail the way it did in those years. And I said, "Wendell, why are you sending $12 a month to a box in Enid?" He did not move. That is the thing I want you to see. A man who is caught moves, even a little. My husband sat in that chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands together, and he watched the sun go down, and he said in a voice as level as a table, "Hattie Coombs has got no business." I said, "That is not an answer." And he said, "It is a debt I took on before I ever knew you." I said, "To who?" And Wendell Prather said, "To a man that is dead now, and I pay his people, and I would appreciate it if you would let me be a man about the one thing I have got left." And he got up and went in the house. I want to point out what he did there, because I have seen it done since, and I know the shape of it now. He did not deny it, so I could not catch him in a lie. He gave it a name that made it sound honorable, a debt, a man's business. He put a dead man in it, because you cannot ask a dead man. And then he made me ashamed of myself for asking, and he walked away. So the last thing in the air was my shame, and not his answer. I sat on that porch until it was full dark, and when I got up to go in, Vesta Hoyle was standing at the end of the porch by the wash bench. and I do not know how long she had been there, and my heart came up in my throat. She said, "Mrs. Prather?" I said, "Yes." And she said, quiet, not unkindly, "Ask him what year he came to this place. Ask him in front of somebody that can count." Then she went around the house to the back door and stepped over the third board. On the 26th of September, my husband and Cleve Dorn took the truck to Guyman to see about a man who was said to be buying feeders, and they left at 6 in the morning and would not be back before dark. And Desi went with Vesta down to the draw for the last of the plums. I had the place to myself for the first time since the 14th of April. I want to tell you what it is like to search your own house. Nobody talks about that. A house you have kept for 26 years has no secrets in it, or that is what you think. And then you stand in the middle of your own front room at 7 in the morning with your hands hanging down, and you understand that you have never once in your life opened 4 or 5 particular things, not because they were locked, but because they were his. I went at the bureau first. Top drawer, his collars and his stud box, and a razor strop, and a tin of court plaster, and 40 years of the small hardware of a man's life. Nothing. Second drawer, his winter shirts. Nothing. The bottom of the chifforobe, where the tin document box sits, and that box is locked and has been locked since I came to that house, and the key is on the ring in my husband's pocket. And I stood there and shook that box like a girl shaking a Christmas parcel and put it back. I went through the pockets of his good coat. I have never done that before or since. There was a receipt for a gasket and 11 cents. By 8 o'clock, I had run out of the places a person is supposed to look, and I sat down at my kitchen table, and I thought about it the way you think about where you left the scissors, which is to say, I stopped hunting and let it come. And what came was my mother-in-law's trunk. There is a smokehouse out past the well, brick on the bottom and boards on top, and it had not smoked a piece of meat since about 1929, because we had not had a hog worth the salt. It had gotten to be the place where things went that nobody could bring themselves to burn. And under the meat bench, in the back of it, was Melinda Prather's trunk, my husband's mother's, a humpback thing with a strap and a tray, and I had not had the lid up on it since the winter she died in 1921. It was already 90 degrees in that smokehouse at 8:30 in the morning. I remember that it smelled of old smoke and salt and dirt, and that there was a wasp nest the size of a saucer up in the corner, gone gray and quiet, and that a bar of light came in the door behind me and lay across the floor with the dust turning in it. The lid was heavy and the hinge screamed. The tray on top had exactly what you would expect: a christening gown gone the color of weak tea, 2 hymnals, a cigar box of buttons, a broken pocket watch with no crystal. Under the tray, quilts, 3 of them, and the smell of camphor came up so strong out of them that my eyes ran. Under the quilts, a bundle of receipts from a store in Woodward, tied up from before the war, and a school certificate with Wendell's name on it in a fine round hand from the year 1898, and a lock of somebody's hair in a fold of paper. And under all of that, flat against the bottom boards of the trunk, there was a packet in oilcloth, tied around twice with binder twine. I sat back on my heels. You want to know what that is like? I will tell you what it is like. Your hands know first. My hands went cold in a smokehouse in September in Oklahoma at 90 degrees, and I sat back on my heels with my knees in the dirt, and I looked at that oilcloth packet for what must have been 2 minutes without touching it. and the whole time there was a voice in my head, a perfectly calm, reasonable voice, saying, "Put the quilts back, Alma. Put the tray back. Shut the lid. You can still put it back." I have thought since about how many women have sat on their heels in front of some equivalent of that packet, and how many put the lid down. The twine was stiff, and I broke a nail on the knot and finally cut it on the edge of the meat bench hook. The oilcloth had gone hard, and it cracked when I opened it, and there was newspaper inside that, folded from the woodward paper, and the paper was so old it came apart along the folds when I lifted it. There were 3 things in there. The first was a photograph on a card. A young man in a stiff collar sitting down, and a young woman standing beside him with her hand on his shoulder, in front of a painted background of a garden, the way they did. He was about 24. He had his hair parted in the middle and a mustache that was trying its best, and he was my husband, and there was no more doubt about it than there is about my own name. And she was tall, and she stood with her back like a fence post, and she was looking straight into that camera without a bit of a smile, and she was the woman who had strung beans with me on my porch 3 weeks before. The second was an envelope, and inside it a smaller card, and it was the certificate of a marriage. It said at the top, Territory of Oklahoma, County of Woodward. It said that on the 9th day of May, in the year of our Lord 1907, Wendell A. Prather, aged 23 years, and Vesta Hoyle, aged 16 years, were joined together in holy matrimony by the minister named beneath, and there were the witnesses in their own hands, and the first witness was D. Hoyle, 16 years old. The third thing was a single sheet, folded twice, and it was in a young woman's handwriting, and it was not addressed to anybody and not signed, and it was a list. 9 lines. Sheets, 2 pair. Iron kettle. Her mother's dishes, blue. 6 hens and the rooster, $12. And down at the bottom, in the same hand, the words, "What he is to keep for me until I come back." I do not know how long I sat in that smokehouse. I know that when I got up, my legs had gone so dead I had to hold the meat bench, and I know that I came out into the yard, into the light and the heat, and stood there with those 3 things in my hand, and could not think of one single place in the world to put them down. I know I looked at the house, my own house, the porch with the 3rd board and the tin patch on the ceiling over the door, and it had come loose from me. That is the only way I can say it. It looked like a photograph of a house. Then I went in and set the coffee pot on and did not light the stove under it, and sat at my table. I want to walk you through what I did with it in my mind in the next hour, because I have been told since that I should have gone straight to town, and the people who say that have never had their whole life come apart on a Thursday morning with a wash to do. The first thing I did was try to make it decent. That is what a woman does. He was married at 23 to a girl of 16, and it went wrong, I thought. Girls of 16 leave. Her people went off, or she went off, and it was 2 years and a half before he married me, and there is such a thing as a divorce. And in 1907 and 8 and 9, there was such a thing as a girl going home to her people, and a judge in a county seat granting a decree in about 4 minutes flat. That is what I told myself. He was a divorced man, and he was ashamed of it, because in the country and in that church, a divorced man was a thing, and he was 25 years old and courting a girl from a family with a strict father, and he did not tell me, and he never told me, and he has had to sit with it for 26 years. I got up and moved around the kitchen, and I felt something almost like relief, and that lasted about 4 minutes, and I am going to put down exactly what killed it, because it was one word: $12. It was on the list in her hand, $12, in a girl's handwriting in 1909, in a list of things a man was keeping for her until she came back. And it was the amount that went out of the Verlin post office to a box in Enid on the last week of every month, and had gone out every month for as long as the oldest woman in that store could remember, and had gone out in the September of 1933, and the September of 1934, and the September of 1935, while the note on the West Quarter went to hell, and my daughter kept $4.40 in a box under her bed. You do not send a divorced woman her $12 every month for 26 years. You do not do that out of shame, and you do not do that out of guilt. That is not a man closing a door. That is a man holding one shut. And when I got that far, I got up from my kitchen table and went out on the porch and stood there and said out loud, to nobody, in my own yard, "He never divorced her." There it was, 26 years of my life, and the 2 children I had raised in that house, and the name I had signed on every paper I had ever signed, and the seat I sat in the 4th row of the Second Methodist in Verlin, and every single bit of it hung on a thing I had believed because a man had let me believe it. Then I heard the girls coming up from the draw. I had about 90 seconds and I used them. I put the photograph and the list back in the oilcloth and put the oilcloth back under the quilts and got the tray in and the lid down. I kept the marriage certificate. I put it inside my apron bib, flat against my ribs, and I went in and got the beans on. And when Desi came in the door with a bucket of plums and her sleeves pushed up and said, "Mama, there is a whole tree down there nobody has touched," I said, "Well, we will go back tomorrow with 2 buckets." And Vesta Hoyle came in behind her with the other bucket and set it on the table and looked at me. She stopped. She had her hand on the bucket and she stopped and looked at my face for a good 3 seconds. And I looked back, and there was nothing in that kitchen but 2 women looking at each other over a bucket of wild plums. Then she said, "I will get the jars down." And she got the jars down, and we put up 11 quarts of plum that afternoon, the 3 of us, and I have got 2 of those jars yet, and I have never been able to open either one. That night I lay in the bed beside my husband and listened to him breathe. He slept like a man with nothing on him. 26 years he had slept like that, and I had thought it was because he was steady. And now I understood that it was because he had put it in a trunk in a smokehouse in 1921 when his mother died and had not needed to think about it since. At about 2 in the morning, I got up and went out to the front room and got the family Bible off the shelf and carried it into the kitchen and lit the lamp. I opened the front of it where the births are, and I read that page for the 2nd time in a month, and this time I was not reading it for the names. The births in our Bible take up 1 page and part of another, and they run from 1864, which is Wendell's father, down to my Desi in 1916. The first 11 lines are in Old Man Prather's hand, which slanted hard to the right and pressed so heavy it had gone through in 2 places. The last 4 are in my husband's, which is a small, upright hand, careful, the hand of a man who had been taught to write in a hurry and never had. I put the lamp down beside the book and I read the 4 that were his. Alma Suggs, wife of Wendell A. Prather, born in the year 1888. That was written when we married, and the ink had gone the color of weak coffee. Ellis Prather, born and died the 21st of June, 1910. Same ink, same tired brown. Loyal Prather, born the 9th of July, 1910. Desi Prather, born the 2nd of March, 1916. And that one had gone brown too, but a different brown, redder, the way iron ink goes when it has sat in the bottle. I sat there in my kitchen at 2 in the morning with a coal oil lamp, and I looked at my son's line for a long time before I could say what was the matter with it, and then I had it. It was blacker. Every other line on that page had faded together, the way ink does when it lies in the same book in the same light for 25 years. My son's line had not faded the same, and the letters in it were crowded, pushed up close, the way you write when you are fitting words into a place that is not big enough for them. And my husband did not write crowded. Look at any other line on that page. That man wrote like a fence. And under the date, when I turned the page to the light and held it at an angle, the paper was not right. It was thin there. It had been scraped, and the ink had run a little into the scrape the way it will, in one small feathered place, under the word July. I want to be honest about what I did with that. I sat and looked at it for maybe 20 minutes, and then I made up a reason, and the reason was this. He wrote it later. There was a stillbirth in that house in the June of 1910, and a live baby in the July, and I was 3 weeks out of my head with fever in between, and no man on this earth would have sat down calmly at that desk in those weeks and made a neat entry in a Bible. He wrote it later, and he wrote it crowded because he had to fit it under the line that was already there, and he scraped it because he got the date wrong the first time and corrected it. That is a good reason. It held me for 11 days. It is exactly the kind of reason a woman gives herself at 2 in the morning so that she can go back to bed. And I want any woman listening to know that I do not blame myself for it, and I do not blame you for yours. I put the Bible back on the shelf, and I went to bed, and I lay there beside him until it got light. The next morning, I went out to the windmill and asked Vesta Hoyle who she was. She was greasing the head, up on the platform with her skirt tied around, which was a thing she did about every 10 days, and which no woman I have ever known could do. I stood down at the bottom with the certificate in my apron bib, and I waited until she came down. And she came down and wiped her hands on a rag and looked at me, and she knew. I said, the 9th of May, 1907, Woodward County. And Vesta Hoyle let out a breath she had been holding for 5 months, and put the rag in her pocket and said, thank God. We sat down on the tank curb in the shade. It was the 28th of September, and the wind was up, and there was a fine tan haze standing over everything, the way there always was, and my hands would not stay still, and I put them under my arms. She told it plain, and she told it in order, and she did not once try to make me feel anything, and that is the reason I believed her before she was half through. She was Dutch Hoyle's youngest. They had a section and a half down on the Cimarron, and her father was hard and good with stock and could not read. She married Wendell Prather in the May of 1907, at 16, out of her father's house, and her father did not want it, and gave in, and when he gave in all the way that kind of man does, and he deeded her a quarter section as her portion. Not to Wendell, to her. That was not usual, and it was not unheard of. And Dutch Hoyle did it because he did not trust the boy and wanted his girl to have a floor under her. She came to this house in the June of 1907. She lived in it 2 years and 2 months. She papered the north room herself with a blue paper with a vine in it, and it went bad along the chimney the first 2 winters. She hung the broom on the nail behind the door because Melinda Prather told her to, and because a broom by that stove gets soot on it. In the May of 1909, her mother took sick over at Enid, where her mother's people were, and Vesta went on the train to nurse her, and she was to be gone 3 weeks, and she left a list of her things on the kitchen table. It was not 3 weeks. Her mother lingered all that summer, and in the September the typhoid came through that house and took her mother and her mother's sister in 11 days, and left Vesta in a bed for 9 weeks with her hair coming out. She wrote twice in the summer and got a letter back both times, short ones, saying the wheat and the weather. Then nothing. And in the October of 1909, while she was still too weak to walk out to the gate, her husband came to Enid. She said he came on the evening train and stayed 2 days. She said he sat by that bed and held her hand and told her the wheat had made 11 bushels, and that his mother was poorly, and that she was to get well and come home. She said he brought her a bag of lemon drops and a folded paper he wanted her to put her name to, and she asked him what it was, and he said it was about her father's ground. And she said she would sign nothing until she could read it standing up, and he put it back in his coat and never said another word about it. And then he went home on the Thursday train. He had been married to me for 3 weeks. He had stood up in the Second Methodist in Verlin on the 11th of September, 1909, with my father's hand on my arm. And 4 weeks later, he was sitting on the edge of that bed in Enid with the lemon drops. She wrote in the December herself in her own hand and got no answer. She wrote in the January to Melinda Prather, her husband's own mother, and got no answer to that. And by the January, she knew she was carrying, and she had known who the father was without having to think about it, because there had been nobody else in the world. And in the March of 1910, she got on the train with $11 and came back to Sawyer County. She walked up to that house from the section road because there was nobody to fetch her, and she was 5 months gone, and it was cold, and there was a woman on the porch shaking out a rug. That was me. I do not remember it. I want that in here. I have gone over the spring of 1910 1,000 times, and I cannot bring up a woman on that road. And Vesta said she never came into the yard. She said she stood on the section road at the corner of the fence for the better part of an hour and looked at a woman in a blue apron shaking out a rug on the porch of her own house. And then she walked back to Verlin, 7 miles, and sat in the depot. And in the evening, Wendell Prather came and found her there. He was 26 years old. He sat down beside her on a bench in that depot, and he did not touch her. She said he was gray in the face, and that the first thing out of his mouth was not hello and was not her name. He said, "It is done, Vesta." And she said, "What is done?" "You were sitting on my bed in October." And he said, again, in the same voice, "It is done." She asked him whether he had a paper. She was 16 when she married, and 19 then, and she did not know much law, but she knew there is such a thing as a paper. And Wendell Prather said there was a paper, and that it had been done in the fall while she was sick, and that she had been served and had not answered. She had not been served. She had been flat in a bed in Enid, with her hair coming out in the comb, and the man telling her she had been served had sat beside that bed for 2 days and fed her lemon drops and never opened his mouth about it. And she knew right there on that bench that a girl of 19 knows the sound of a lie in the mouth of a man she has slept beside. She said, "Then let me see it." And he said he would bring it to her. And then he gave her $12 and put her on the train. And he told her that if she came back to that county, he would swear out a paper on her. And she said, "What kind of a paper?" And he said, "The kind they take a woman off in a wagon for." Now, she was 19. She was 6 months along. She had no mother and no money, and her father had died in the January while she was sick. and the section and a half had gone to the notes and to her brothers. And there is not a court in the territory or the new state of Oklahoma in 1910 that would have taken the word of a girl in her condition over the word of a landed man with a mother in the church. And every woman listening who is over 60 knows I am telling the truth. She went back to Enid on that train. And the $12 came the next month, and the month after that. And it has come every month since, to a box she rented in the September of 1910, and has kept for 25 years. And it has come from a post office in Verlin, Oklahoma, in an envelope with nothing else in it, not one word, not one time. I said, "Vesta, why did you take it?" And she said, "Because it was the only place on this earth where he had to write my name down." I got up off that tank curb and walked about 20 feet and stood with my back to her. And I want to say I was thinking about her, and I was not. I was thinking about myself, standing on a porch in the March of 1910, in a blue apron with a rug in my hands, 22 years old and 3 months married, and happier than I have ever been since. And a girl of 19 standing at the corner of the fence in the cold, looking at me. I said, "What happened to the baby?" And Vesta Hoyle sat on that tank curb in the wind and did not answer me. I said it again, and she said, "Mrs. Prather, I am going to ask you to leave that one alone until I can put it in front of you with something to hold it up. Because if I say it to you today, and you go in that house and say it to him tonight, you will have nothing but my mouth and his mouth. And I have been on the wrong end of that arrangement for 25 years. That was the smartest thing anybody said to me in 1935, and I did not listen to it. I confronted my husband that same evening, and it went exactly the way she said it would. I waited until Desi was down at the Nash place and Cleve was at the barn. I put the marriage certificate face up on the oilcloth in the middle of my kitchen table, and I sat down at my end and I waited for him to come in from the lot. He came in and washed his hands at the basin and dried them and turned around and saw it. I have wondered all my life what a different man would have done. I think a different man would have gone white, or shouted, or sat down hard. My husband stood at that basin with the towel in his hands and looked at that card on the table for a good 5 seconds. And then he folded the towel in half and hung it on the nail and came over and sat down in his chair. He said, "Where?" I said, "Your mother's trunk." He said, That is what he said. His mother had said it, and Dr. Sable had said it, and now he said it. And I had lived in that house so long that I had come to think of that sound as a thing men say instead of a thing men use. Then he said, "Alma, I want you to listen to me and not talk for a minute." And I listened, and here is what he gave me. He said he had married a girl of 16 when he was 23, and it was over inside of 2 years. He said she went to Enid and did not come back, and he had every reason on this earth to believe she was dead because there was typhoid in that town in the fall of 1909, and 40 people died of it, and one of them was her mother, and one of them, he was told, was her. I said, "Told by who?" He said, "By a letter from a woman in that house." I said, "Have you got it?" And he said, "That was 26 years ago." And then I asked him the only question I had thought out beforehand, and I asked it in the flattest voice I could manage, the way you ask a man whether he wants his eggs turned over. I said, "When did you last lay eyes on her? Before this April, I mean." And Wendell Prather said, "The spring of 1909, when she got on the train." I did not say one word. I sat at my own table with my hands in my lap, and I looked at my husband, and I let it go by, and he took a drink of his coffee, and outside the window the windmill turned twice. He had sat on the edge of that woman's bed in Enid in the October of 1909 with a sack of lemon drops in his coat, 4 weeks after he stood up in a church with me. I had it from her that morning, out at the tank, and he had just handed me the lie with his own hand, and I put it in my apron pocket and left it there for 11 days. Then he said that he had gone to the county seat in the spring of 1910 and had a decree, and that it was in the county records at Woodward, and that he would drive over there and get a copy of it and put it in my hand. I said, "When?" And Wendell Prather said, "Monday." Now I want to explain what that did to me, because it is a thing that is done to people all the time, and it has got no name that I know of. It gave me back my life for 4 days. That is what it did. He did not argue with the certificate. He did not deny a word of it. He agreed with every single fact I had. And then he put one more fact on the end of the row, a fact that could be looked up in a courthouse by anybody. And he said he would go get it Monday. And there is not a woman alive who would not take that. I went to bed that night, in the same bed, beside that man, and I slept, and I have not forgiven myself for that sleep. He went to Woodward on Monday the 30th of September. He was gone from 6 in the morning until 9 at night, and he came back and stood in my kitchen with his hat in his hand and told me that the county clerk had been very obliging and had spent 2 hours with him and that the decree was not there. He said the girl in the office had told him that a good deal of that period was lost and that there had been a fire in the courthouse and that there was nothing in that office out of 1909 that anybody could put a hand on. And he said, "Alma, I am sorry. I know how that sounds." I said, "It sounds like a man with no paper." And my husband said, "Then I have got no paper." He said it the way you would say it about a hoe you had left out in the rain. And then he said one more thing before he went out on the porch, and I did not understand it for about 2 weeks. And when I did understand it, I understood everything else with it. He stood at the door with his hat, and he said, without any heat at all, "Whatever else you turn over, Alma, leave the boy be." Hattie Coombs drove me to the county seat on the 3rd of October in a 1929 Chevrolet with a cracked windshield. And she did it on her own half-day, and she did it without my asking twice. I had gone into Verlin to mail a letter, and she came around the end of the counter and said, "Alma, sit down on that nail keg a minute." And she said, "I have known you 18 years, and I have not slept right since the day I opened my mouth about that money order. And if you are going over to Sawyer City, you are not going in a truck that boils, and you are not going alone, and you are not going to have to tell anybody why." We went on the Thursday. It is 41 miles, and it took us 2 hours and a quarter, and we hardly talked at all. The courthouse at Sawyer City is a square brick building with a stone step worn into a dish in the middle from 80 years of boots, and the recorder's office is on the ground floor at the back, and it smells the way all of them smell, like paper and floor oil and cold iron. There was a woman behind the counter about my age named Pearl Stack with a green eyeshade on. And she was the sort who has decided that the public is a nuisance and then helps you for an hour and a half anyway. I said, "I need to find a decree of divorce." She said, "Name and year." I said, "Prather. 1909 or 1910. She went and got the book. There was no decree in the year 1909. There was no decree in the year 1910. She went and got the appearance docket, which is a different book, and there was no case. She looked up Prather in the general index for every year from 1907 to 1914, and Pearl Stack ran her finger down a column and turned a page and ran her finger down another one, and after a while she said, without any particular tone, "There is no divorce in this county with that name in it." And she wrote out the years she had searched on a slip of paper and signed her name to it because I asked her to. And that slip is the first piece of paper I ever asked anybody to sign in my life. I said, "Could it have been Woodward County?" She said it could, and she went to her telephone and got the clerk over at Woodward on the long distance, which cost me 80 cents that I paid at the window, and she talked to a woman over there for about 10 minutes with her eye shade pushed up, and when she hung up she said, "They will write," but she went and looked while I held on. She said there is no decree over there either, in either year, in that name. And I said, "Was there ever a fire in that courthouse?" Pearl Stack looked at me for a second and then she said, "No, ma'am, there has never been a fire in the Woodward County Courthouse." I want to tell you that I felt something at that, and it was not a good, clean thing. It was a kind of triumph in a courthouse on a Thursday over a man I had been married to for 26 years. It came up in me hot, and it went away again and left me sick. Hattie was standing at the end of the counter with her purse in front of her, and she said, "Ask her about the ground." I said, "What?" And Hattie Coombs said, "Alma, ask about the ground." So I said, "I would like to see the deed record on the northwest quarter of Section 11. That is the west quarter with the windmill on it. That is the piece I had been told for 26 years that Wendell had bought with money he put together before we married, and that carried the note I was not to worry about, and that was going on the courthouse steps in front of that same building on the first Monday in November." Pearl Stack got the plat book, and then she got the deed record, and then she got another one, and she laid 3 big books open on the counter side by side and turned them around to face me, and she put her finger on the first entry and took me down that ground the way a school teacher takes a child down a column of figures. Patent from the United States, 1894, sold twice. Then, in the June of 1907, a warranty deed from Dutch Hoyle, a widower at that time of Sawyer County, to Vesta Hoyle, his daughter, for love and affection and $1. To her, not to them, to her, 4 weeks after she was married, from a man who could not read his own name and had it read to him by the clerk. Then the next entry, and there were 2 papers in it, and Pearl Stack said, "This one is filed together," and turned the book so I could see. The first was an affidavit. I have got a certified copy of it in a drawer in this house, and I could recite it to you with my eyes shut. But I will give you the part that matters. State of Oklahoma, County of Sawyer, Wendell A. Prather, being first duly sworn, upon his oath deposes and says that he is the surviving spouse of Vesta Hoyle Prather, deceased, that the said Vesta Hoyle Prather departed this life at Enid, Garfield County, Oklahoma, on or about the 14th day of October, 1909, of typhoid fever, that she died intestate, that she left surviving her no child or children and no father or mother, and that this affiant is her sole and only heir at law. Sworn to and subscribed before me this 11th day of June, 1910. And under it, in the same ink, in that small, upright, careful hand, my husband's signature. The second paper filed with it was the transfer, and it put the northwest quarter of Section 11 out of the name of Vesta Hoyle Prather, deceased, and into the name of Wendell A. Prather, sole heir. I had my hands flat on that counter and I read the affidavit 3 times, and the 3rd time I got down to the words, "No child or children," and my ears started ringing. Because on the 11th day of June, 1910, that woman was alive in a rooming house in Enid, Oklahoma, and she was 8 months and a half gone. He did not say she died. Any man can be wrong about a death. He swore, in front of a notary, that there was no child. He swore it in June, 10 days before I lost mine, 4 weeks before hers was born. He knew there was a child. He had been sitting on the edge of her bed in the October. He had put her on the train himself in the March, with her coat not buttoning. He wrote out with his own hand that there was no child, because a child would have been an heir, and an heir would have had a claim on 160 acres of good pasture with a windmill on it, and my husband was a man who thought a thing all the way through to the end and then never thought about it again. Pearl Stack said, "Ma'am, do you want to sit down?" I said no. I said, "I want certified copies of every bit of it." That cost me $2.40, which was more money than I had spent on myself in a year, and while she was making them out, Hattie Coombs took me by the elbow and walked me across the square to an office over the drugstore with a name painted on the glass. And that is how I came to be sitting in front of Judd Ivory. He was 33 years old. There was a diploma on the wall, and a bad chair, and a picture of a wheat field. And the reason there was a picture of a wheat field was that his people had farmed 6 miles from ours, and had lost it in 32, and I had known his mother. He read the affidavit first. He read it twice and did not say anything. And then he set it down and squared it up with 2 fingers, and he said, "Mrs. Prather, before I tell you what I think, I want you to tell me the plain facts in the plain order, and do not leave anything out because it is unpleasant." So I told him. The dust storm, and the woman, and the broom, and the well, and the papered room, and the money order to Enid, and the marriage certificate out of a trunk, and Cleve Dorn on the porch in 1908, and the woman herself sitting on the tank curb, telling me about a bag of lemon drops in the October. Judd Ivory listened to all of it with his elbows on the desk and his chin on his hands. And when I was done, he was quiet a while, and then he said, "All right, here is where you are." He said, "First, there is no decree in either county. Until a paper turns up somewhere else in this state, and I do not believe one will, your husband's marriage to Vesta Hoyle in 1907 was never dissolved, and that means that his marriage to you in the September of 1909 was void. Not voidable, void. In the law, it never happened." I said, "Then what am I?" And he said, "In the eyes of the law, you are Alma Suggs, a single woman, and you have got no dower and no widow's right and no share of anything of his, and I am sorry to say it that flat, but you will do better knowing it." He said, "Second, your 2 children are, in the language of the statute, illegitimate." He put his hand up. "Now hear the rest of it before that lands. Oklahoma is better on that than a good many states. And there is a way to have them declared legitimate. And there is a way to protect Desi's rights. And we will do all of it. And nobody is going to take that girl's name away from her in Sawyer County or anywhere else." But you asked me for it straight. I said, "Third." And Judd Ivory said, "Third is the ground, and the ground is where he is going to break." He said that an affidavit of heirship is only as good as the truth in it, and that this one had 2 lies in it that could be proved with living witnesses and a courthouse index. He said the woman he swore was dead was going to walk into that room on her own 2 feet. He said that when the affidavit fell, the transfer fell with it, and the northwest quarter of Section 11 had never once in 25 years been my husband's to mortgage. I said, "But the bank has got the note." And Ivory said, "The bank has got a note signed by a man who was not the owner." He looked out his window at the square. Otho Renfrew is not going to like his Thursday. Then he said, and this is the part I did not expect, he said, "Mrs. Prather, the sale is the first Monday in November, which is 19 days from today. If we go into court and ask a judge to stop that sale, we are going to be a month getting a hearing, and by then it will be sold." He said, "So I am going to do something a little different, and you are not going to like it, and it will work." I said, "What?" And Judd Ivory said, "We are going to let him get all the way up onto those steps." I have thought about that man a great deal since. He never sent me a bill. He sent me a card at Christmas for 11 years. Hattie Coombs did not say one word until we were out on the section road with the sun going down in front of us. Then she said, "Alma, I have got something I have been chewing on since the store, and you are going to have to let me get it out crooked." I said, "All right." And she said, "The money order to Enid. It did not start in 1922 when I got the window. Nettie Fisk had the window before me, and Nettie kept her stamp books, and when she died, her daughter gave them to the store because nobody knew what else to do with them, and they are in a box in the back under the oilcloth." She had both hands on the wheel. I have looked. The first one to that box in Enid went out the last week of the August, 1910. I said, "August," and Hattie said, "The last week of August, 1910. $12. And there is not one before it going back to 1906. Now think with me. The child was born, Vesta told me later, on the 9th of July, 1910. My Ellis was born dead on the 21st of June, 1910. And I lay in a bed in that house out of my head with the fever for the better part of 3 weeks after it. And my husband was gone from that house for 11 days of it. And his mother told me he had gone to see about a woman in his family that had died, and that he had brought back what was left of her. He came home in the 3rd week of July, 1910, with a baby boy 9 days old, wrapped in a man's coat. And in the last week of the August, 1910, 6 weeks later, a money order for $12 went out of the Verlin post office to a box in Enid, Oklahoma, and one went out every month after that for 25 years, and my husband called it a debt he had taken on before he ever knew me. He was not paying a debt, he was paying rent on a silence, and I had been putting his supper in front of him for 25 years. It was full dark when Hattie let me out at the end of my own lane, and I stood there and watched her taillights go, and then I looked up at my house. Every window in it was lit. Desi had the lamp on the kitchen table, and there was one in the front room and one in the back, and I could hear from where I stood my daughter's voice and then a laugh, and the laugh was Vesta's. Somebody had the wireless on that Cleve had rigged to a battery, and there was music coming out of my house across 100 feet of bare dirt. I have thought many times about what a man's life looks like from the outside when you know what is in it. I went in and hung up my coat and said the drive was long and that I had a headache, and I did not eat, and I went and sat on the edge of my own bed in the dark for about an hour with my hands in my lap. Then I got up and went and knocked on the door of the back room. Vesta Hoyle opened it in her nightdress with her hair down, and it was gray and thin and down past her waist, and she looked at my face and she stood back from the door. I said, The 9th of July, 1910, and that woman put out one hand and took hold of the door frame. She told it sitting on the edge of that bed with her hands between her knees, and I sat in the little cane chair by the window, and it took her about 40 minutes because she stopped twice. She had the child in a rooming house on Cherokee Street in Enid, kept by a woman named Ora Bledsoe. She was 2 days at it. There was no doctor, and there was a woman from down the street who did that work in that part of town. The boy was born the 9th of July in the morning, and she heard him cry, and she saw him for about as long as it takes to say it. And then they carried him out of the room to be washed, and Ora Bledsoe came back and said he was a fine big boy, but that he was blue about the mouth, and that they had best keep him warm by the kitchen stove. She did not see him again. At 8 o'clock that evening, Ora Bledsoe came in and sat down on the bed and took her hand and told her that the baby had died at 6:30. She asked to see him. She was told it would not do her any good. She was told she was torn and had a fever and would be killed by it. She was 19 years old, and she had no mother and no money, and she was in another woman's house. And she lay in that bed for 9 days, and on the 4th day, they told her he was buried in the corner of the cemetery where they put the ones with no stone. She got up and went to that corner as soon as she could walk, and there were 4 little places in it, and no stone on any of them. And she picked one, and she has been going to it on the 9th of July for 25 years. I said, "Vesta," and she said, "Let me finish it while I can." In the January of 1935, Ora Bledsoe died. She was 81. Her daughter came to the boarding house where Vesta had a room 6 blocks away because Vesta was on a list of people her mother had said to tell, and she brought with her an envelope that had been in her mother's dresser for 25 years with Vesta's name on it. She had it with her that night. She got it out of the suitcase, the leather one, and gave it to me, and I read it sitting in the cane chair with the lamp on the sill, and I have got that letter yet. It was 1 page in a poor hand, and it said, near enough, "I done a thing in July of 1910 I have carried since. Your boy did not die. He was well and hollering. His father come and give me $60 and said he had a wife at home that had lost hers and was dying of it, and that a live child would keep her alive. He said you was young and would have others. I fed that boy at my own table for 9 days, and he went off in a coat on the train the 18th of July with that man. The Lord knows I have prayed about it. He come from Sawyer County. At the bottom of it she had written, I never spent the $60. It is in the bank at Enid in your name. Vesta said, I sat in that room and looked at the wall until it got light. And then in the February, I went to Sawyer County. And there is not one thing in this world you can do with a letter from a dead woman that says a man took a baby. And I knew that walking in, because I have been trying to get somebody to look at a piece of paper about that man since I was 19 years old. She said, so I got a job. She said, I did not know which house. I knew the name Prather, and I knew the country. I have hired out at 3 places in this county since the February. I hoed at the Nash place, and I cooked for the thresher crew at Wagner's. And I looked at every young man in this end of the panhandle, and none of them was the right age. And then in the April, I found out that the Prathers had a boy who had gone off to California, and there was a dust storm coming up out of the north, and I walked out to that house in it because I could not wait 1 more day. I said, why did you not ask me? April, May, June, I would have showed you his picture. I did show you his picture. And Vesta Hoyle said, Ma'am, what was I to say? I have got a letter from a dead woman, and I would like to see your son's hands." I said, "His hands?" And she held up her own left hand in the lamplight. The little finger on Vesta Hoyle's left hand crooks in at the last joint and will not lie flat. It is not a hurt, it is the way it grew. She said her father's was the same, and her oldest brother's was the same, and it goes in that family the way red hair goes in others. I sat in that cane chair in my own back room at 11 o'clock at night, and I could see, as plain as if he was in the room, my boy of 7 standing in that kitchen, crying and holding out his hand, and me saying, "Oh, honey, you have got it caught in the pulley," and his father saying from the door, in a voice like a table, "No, he was born so, he was born so." Wendell had said it in front of me. He had said it in front of the child. I said, "Get your shoes on." We went out to the kitchen and I lit the lamp and I got the Bible off the shelf and put it on the oilcloth and opened it to the front. And I turned it so it was under the light, and the two of us stood over it. And I turned the page up on edge and held it toward the flame so the light came through. Loyal Prather, born the 9th of July, 1910. The paper under the last part of that line was thin as an onion skin. It had been scraped with something, a knife or a razor, and scraped hard, and the ink of the last 3 words sat a little into the scrape and had feathered where it went. And when you held it up to a flame and looked through it from behind, you could see the ghost of what had been under there. Not the letters, but the weight of them, the pressure a pen leaves in paper. There had been more words on that line. It had said, once, before somebody took a blade to it, something after the year. 3 or 4 words, and the way the marks lay and the length of them, the last of them was a short one, 4 letters, and it began with an E. At Enid. I want to say that we cried, and we did not. We stood at that table with the lamp between us, a woman of 47 and a woman of 44, and we looked at a Bible for a long time, and neither one of us made a sound. And then Vesta Hoyle put out her hand and touched the page with 2 fingers, right on the name, the way you would touch a face. The next morning, I drove to Verlin and knocked at Dr. Sable's door at 7:30. He was 71, and he was up and dressed, and he had his coffee. And he took me into the front room, where he had seen half the county for 40 years. And I put it to him, without any wrapping at all. I said, "Doctor, did you deliver a living child in my house in the July of 1910? And that old man set his cup down in the saucer and said, "No." He said, "I delivered a dead one in the June and near lost you with it, and you know that." He said, "I did not set foot in that house again until the September, when Melinda called me out for your chest." I said, "In the July, my husband came home with a baby 9 days old and told me it was his cousin's out of Woodward County, and that she had died of it, and that the man could not keep it." And Dr. Sable said, "I know what he told you." He got up and went to the window and stood there with his back to me, and he said, "He brought that child into me in this room the last week of July and asked me to look him over. He said, 'Alma, I have delivered better than 1,100 babies in this county, and there is not a man alive who can tell me a 2-week-old child from a 2-day-old one and make me believe it.' He said, 'The cord was off and healed. The head was round. That was not a new baby.' I said, 'And you never said a word?' And he turned around and he said, 'No, I never.' He said there was a woman out on that place that had lost hers and had a fever of 104 and had quit talking, and that is a thing I have seen kill women when nothing else would. And her husband set a living baby in her arms, and inside of 4 days she was sitting up and taking soup. He said, I looked at that and I made a bargain with myself, and I have kept it for 25 years, and I have never once been easy about it. And then he said, and I will say every word of it in front of anybody you like, and I will bring my book, because I wrote it down at the time. I wrote down what I thought, and I dated it, because I have been at this long enough to know that a man ought to write down the thing he is not going to say. He had it in a ledger. The last week of July, 1910, in his own hand, child brought by W. Prather, said to be 9 days, is more like 15. Not asked, not told. God forgive me. I drove home with that certified in my lap, and I did not feel one thing. That is what people never understand about the moment it all comes together. There is no thunder in it. You get to the bottom step, and there is nothing under it, and you find that you are perfectly calm, and your hands do what they are supposed to do, and you notice that the pasture gate is off its hinge, and you think, I will get Cleve to see to that gate. Wendell was at the lot. I walked out there with the copy of the affidavit in one hand and Dr. Sable's page in the other, and I stood at the fence and waited until he came over. And he came over slow, and he looked at the papers before he looked at me. I said, there is no decree in Sawyer County, and there is none in Woodward, and there has never been a fire in that courthouse in the history of this state. He did not say anything. I said, on the 11th of June, 1910, you swore in front of a notary that your wife was dead and that there was no child, and you took her father's quarter section out of her name and put it in yours, and you have carried a note on it ever since that you have not paid in 2 years. He put his hands on the top wire. And I said, on the 18th of July, 1910, you carried a 9-day-old boy out of a rooming house in Enid in your coat, and you paid the woman $60, and you told me your cousin died, and I fed him, and I sat up with him, and I taught him his letters, and I have thanked you for him. 25 years, Wendell, you let me thank you for him. And my husband said, quiet, looking at the cattle, you would have died. I said, that is your answer? And he said, it is the truth, Alma. Sable will tell you, you would have died. I set a live child in your arms, and you come back. He turned around then and looked at me, and there was something in his face that I had never seen there, and it was not shame, and it was not fear. He was proud of it, and he said, I have never been sorry for that one thing, and I am not going to stand at this fence and say I am. I said, and the $12? He said, she took it. I said, you swore there was no child. She was carrying when you wrote it. And Wendell Prather said, if I had wrote a child on that paper, that quarter would have gone into a guardianship for a boy in Enid, and I would have lost the water and the pasture both. He said it the way a man explains why he set the wheat in the north field instead of the south. And then he said, and where would that baby have been raised? In a rooming house in Enid, by a 19-year-old girl with nothing. He is a grown man in California with a trade, because I done what I done. I said, his mother has slept in my back room since April, and you have not spoke to her once. And my husband said, there is nothing to say. I said, I am going to tell him, and here is where he moved, and it was the only time in 26 years, and I want it written down exactly. He came off that fence and took 2 steps and stopped, and he said, in a voice with the bottom gone out of it, you tell that boy and you lose him. I said, he is not mine to lose. You saw to that in 1910. And Wendell Prather said, "He is yours. He has never had another one. He is yours, and if you open your mouth, he will go back to California, and he will not write, and you will get a card at Christmas from a man that calls you Alma," he said. "And Desi will be a bastard in this county, and she will not go to any teacher's college with that hanging on her. And every woman that has sat at your table will know that you was never married a day in your life." And he said, "I have kept all of that off of you for 25 years. Nobody had ever said the plain shape of it to me before, and hearing it in his mouth, in that voice, with his hands hanging down, was the worst 2 minutes of my life." I went in the house and sat down at the kitchen table. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Cleve Dorn came in from Verlin with the mail, and there was a yellow envelope in it, and it was a telegram, and it was from my son. It said that he was coming home on the 15th of October. It said he had money for the note. It said, in the last 5 words, that I was not to tell his father, that he wanted to do it himself. He had $160 saved in a bank in Bakersfield, and he was coming home to save his father's farm with it, and he would be standing in my kitchen in 11 days. There were 11 days between that telegram and my son coming home, and my husband spent them being the best man I ever knew. I want anybody listening who has been on the receiving end of that to hear this part, because it is the piece nobody warns you about. He did not threaten me again. He never once raised his voice or his hand or even his eyebrows. He got up on the Saturday and hung the pasture gate that had been off its hinge since August. He greased my sewing machine. He came in on the Tuesday with a sack of pecans from a man at Wagner's who owed him a day's work, and set them on the table and said, "Desi likes these." On the Thursday, he cleaned the chimney of my kitchen lamp, which is a thing I have never in my life seen a man do. And every one of those days, he found some quiet way to put his hand on the same place. He said, out on the porch, without looking at me, "That girl has got her whole life in front of her." He said at supper to nobody, "A man's name is all he has got out here, and a woman's is worse." He said on the Friday at the wash bench that he had been thinking he might get the money together for the teacher's college at Alva after all, in the fall, if things broke right. That is how it is done. It is not done with a fist. It is done with a gate hinge and a sack of pecans, and 1 sentence a day about your daughter. By the Wednesday of that week, I was sick to my stomach every morning, and I could not eat, and I could not sleep past 3, and I did the only thing I had left, which was that I told Desi. I did it on the Sunday, on the 11th of October, sitting in the truck out at the end of the lane where nobody could come up on us. I gave it to her in the order I had learned it, and I did not soften one thing, because she was 19 and because she had a right to it, and because I could not carry it another day by myself. She did not cry. She sat there with her hands in her lap in her church dress, and when I got to the end of it, she said, "Is Loyal my whole brother or my half?" I said, "Your half." And she said, "All right." Then she said, and this is the part I would like read at my funeral. She said, "Mama, does he know?" I said, "Your father?" And Desi said, "No, Loyal. Does Loyal know what he is?" I said, "No." And my daughter said, "Then you have got to tell him before Papa does, because Papa will tell it the way that keeps him." She was 19 years old. We sat in that truck for another half hour, and she asked me about the teacher's college, which I had expected and dreaded, and I said, "Honey, This is going to cost you that." And Desi Prather looked out the windshield at 480 acres of blown-out wheat ground and said, "Mama, there was not going to be any Alva. There has not been any Alva since 33. I have got $4.40. Then she said, "I know you know about the box." I told her about the Bible last, and that was the only part that got her. She wanted to see it, and we went in and I got it down and lit the lamp in the middle of the afternoon and held the page up to it, and Desi looked at that scraped place for a long time. And then she said, "You used to tell us, write it in the Bible and it is so." I said, "I did." And my girl said, "Somebody wrote in ours with a knife." Loyal came in on the 15th on the bus that runs from Amarillo through Verlin, and it got in at 4:20 in the afternoon, and I was standing on the sidewalk in front of the store, and Vesta Hoyle was sitting in my truck across the road with her hands in her lap. I had told her she could come. That was mine to give, and I gave it. And I have gone back and forth all my life about whether I did it for her. The bus came in, 4 people got off, and then my son came down those steps with a cardboard suitcase and a jacket over his arm. And he was 25 years old and burned brown from the valley and thicker through the shoulders than when he left. And he saw me, and his whole face went open the way it did when he was 6. And he said, "Mama," and he picked me up off the sidewalk. I want to have that minute back. I have wanted it back for 30 years. Not to change it, just to have it. Over his shoulder, I could see the truck across the road. Vesta Hoyle was sitting in that cab with both hands over her mouth, and she was making no sound at all that I could hear from where I stood. And she was rocking, just a little, the way a person does in a chair, and she did not take her eyes off him. She sat there for the whole 3 or 4 minutes it took my son to shake hands with Hattie Coombs in the door of the store and pick up his suitcase and cross to the truck. And by the time he got there, she had her hands down in her lap and her face put back together. And when I said, "This is Ms. Hoyle, that has been helping me since the spring," my son took his hat off and said, "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," and put out his hand. And Vesta Hoyle shook her son's hand for the first time in 25 years on the 15th of October, 1935, in front of a general store in Verlin, Oklahoma, and said, "Pleased to meet you." She sat in the back of that truck all the way home. Nobody said much. Loyal talked about the road and about a man in Elk City who had a 2-headed calf in a tent and charged a dime. I told him that night. I waited until Wendell had gone out to the barn to see to a heifer, and Desi had taken Vesta down to the Nash place on some errand my daughter invented out of thin air, God bless her. And I sat my son down at that kitchen table with the lamp between us, and I put the papers out in a row, the way Judd Ivory had put them out for me. The marriage certificate from 1907, the certified affidavit from the 11th of June, 1910, the page from Dr. Sable's book, Ora Bledsoe's letter, and last of all, the Bible, open, turned to the front. He read them in order without saying one word. He was always a slow reader, and he read every one of them all the way through, and when he came to the letter, he read it twice. Then he sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time, and what he said, when he finally said something, was not any of the things I had been afraid of for 11 days. He said, "That woman in the truck this evening." I said, "Yes." And my son said, "She has got my hands." He held up his left hand in the lamplight and looked at it, and turned it around and looked at the back of it, and I sat there and watched a grown man meet himself. He said, "Mama, when I was 7, at that table, "You told me I done it in the pulley." I said, "That is what I was told, and that is what I believed, and I am sorry." And Loyal said, "I know it." He got up and went out. He did not slam the door, and he did not take the truck. He walked out the lane and down the section road, and I lost him in the dark inside of 2 minutes. And I sat in that kitchen with the lamp going and the papers on the table for the whole night, and I did not go after him. Wendell came in at 10 and looked at that table and at me and did not say a word. He stood there a minute, and then he went in the bedroom and shut the door, and that man slept, and I want that in the record too. I sat up all night with my son out walking in the dark, and my husband slept on the other side of the wall. Loyal came in at 6:15 in the morning with his boots white with dust to the knee and his eyes red, and he stood in the doorway of the kitchen and said, "Where is she?" I said, "In the back room. She has not slept either. She has been sitting up in that chair since 2. And my son said, "Will you come in with me?" And then he said, "No, never mind. I will go by myself." He was in there about 40 minutes. I do not know what was said, and I have never asked either one of them, and neither one of them has ever told me, and that is theirs. What I know is that at 7 o'clock they came out into my kitchen together, and Vesta's face was swollen up, and my son had his jaw set, and he pulled out a chair for her at my table, and she sat down in it, and he sat down beside her, and he said, "Mama, is there coffee?" And I got the coffee. And we were sitting there, the 3 of us, when my husband came out of that bedroom in his sock feet at 7:30 in the morning and stopped in the door. Nobody stood up. I have been in rooms since where hard things were said, and I have never been in one like that kitchen. Wendell Prather stood in the door of his own kitchen and looked at the table, and there was his wife of 26 years at one end, and his wife of 28 years at the other, and between them the boy. And the boy was looking straight at him. And Loyal said, "Morning, Pop." That was all he said. He did not accuse him of a thing. He said good morning to his father, and it went through that man like a nail. Wendell Prather stood there for a good 5 seconds, and then he turned around and went back in the bedroom and put on his boots and came out through the kitchen without looking at any of us and went to the barn. And he stayed at that barn until dinner. That was the 16th of October. The sale was the 4th of November. In between there were 19 days, and I am going to give them to you short, because they were 19 days of getting ready, and there is not much drama in a woman driving to a county seat. Judd Ivory took Dr. Sable's deposition on the 18th in the front room of the doctor's own house, with a court reporter he brought from Woodward at his own expense, and the old man told all of it into the record and signed it and said afterward that he wished he had done it in 1910. Hattie Coombs brought Nettie Fisk's stamp books to Sawyer City in a pasteboard box with the oilcloth still on them. Pearl Stack certified everything twice. Vesta gave her statement over 2 days, and Ivory made her tell about the lemon drops 4 separate times because he said Otho Renfrew would go at that one. Cleve Dorn made his mark because he could not write and told about hauling the rig in the fall of 1908 and about a young woman with a straight back who thanked a man twice. And Loyal Prather sat in that lawyer's office on the 28th of October and put his left hand flat on a piece of white paper, while a photographer from the newspaper at Sawyer City, who did work on the side, made a picture of it. We told Wendell nothing. He asked nothing. That is the strangest part of those 19 days. He worked. He hauled the last of the feed. He ate at my table twice a day and slept in that bed, and never once asked me where I had been. And I have come to believe that he had decided, somewhere in there, that if he did not ask about it, it was still possible that it was not happening. On the 2nd of November, Sunday, he put on his good coat and went to church, and he shook Reverend Pearl's hand at the door and said the wheat looked like it might come if we got a rain. On the 3rd, Monday, he came in at dark and washed and sat down and said, "Alma, there is nothing they can do about that sale. Renfrew has got the note, and the note is the note." I said, "I expect that is so." And my husband said, "We will be all right. There is a place at Wagner's for a man and a wife, and I have spoke to him." And I sat at that table and looked at a man planning our life for the spring, and I understood that he had gotten all the way to the bottom of it, and had decided that the world would go on the way it had always gone on for him, which was quietly, with the papers in a trunk and nobody asking. I was up at 4 on the 4th of November. I made a fire and I put on my navy dress and my mother's brooch. Desi came out in the dark and did up my hair for me without being asked, and it was the first time in her life she ever did my hair, and neither one of us said anything while she did it. At 6 o'clock, in the pitch dark, 4 of us got into that truck. My son drove, I sat by him. Vesta Hoyle and my daughter sat in the back with a quilt over them and the pasteboard box between their feet. And when we backed out of the lane, the light was on in the kitchen window, and my husband was standing in it in his shirt sleeves with a cup in his hand, watching us go, and he did not raise a hand, and neither did I. A sheriff's sale in 1935 did not look like anything. That is what people who were not there always get wrong. There was no auctioneer's stand and no bunting. There was a stone step in front of a brick courthouse and a man in a coat reading out of a folder at 10 o'clock in the morning. And whoever happened to be standing there was the crowd. But there was a crowd that day, and there had been a crowd at every one of them for 3 years, because by 1935, a sheriff's sale in that country was not a business matter. It was the thing the county did to itself. There were 60 or 70 men on that square and about a dozen women, and they were not there to bid. Most of them were there so that the men who did bid would have to do it in front of somebody. That was how it was done in those years. In some counties, they took it further than looking, and I know of a sale in 33 where a quarter section went for 40 cents and was handed back, and everybody knew who had been in the middle of it, and nobody said. We got there at 8:30. Judd Ivory came out of his office in a suit that had been pressed for the occasion, and looked at the 4 of us standing by that truck and said, "All right, now listen to me, and then I am not going to say it again." He said, "Mrs. Prather, you will stand where I put you, and you will not say one word until I ask you a question." He said, "Ms. Hoyle, the same. And when I do bring you up, you will say your name and your birth year and the date you were married and nothing else on this earth." He said to Loyal, "Son, whatever your father says to you, you will keep your hands in your pockets." And he said to Desi, "Honey, you hold that box and do not set it down." Then he said, and I remember this because it is the only time I ever heard him say anything about himself. He said, "My father lost his place on those steps in the June of 1932, and I stood right over there and could not do a thing about it. And I have been waiting 3 years for the right morning. This is it. Let us go." They cried the sale at 10. Sheriff Bud Galt read the notice, and Otho Renfrew stood at the bottom of the step with his hat in his hand and 2 men from Wichita beside him, and the notice was for the northwest quarter of Section 11, Township 3, and it named the note and the amount, which was $1,140 and some cents, and it named the mortgager Wendell A. Prather. And my husband was there. He had come in with Cleve Dorn in the wagon, and he was standing off at the edge of that crowd in his good coat with his hat in his hands. And when I saw him, my whole chest closed up. He had come to watch his land sell. That is all he had come to do. He had no plan, and no lawyer, and no money. And he had come in and stood at the edge of a crowd like a man at a funeral for a cousin. The sheriff asked for bids, and Judd Ivory walked up onto the step. He said, "Sheriff, before there is a bid, I am handing you a paper, and I am asking you to read it into your return. And I am handing a copy to Mr. Renfrew and a copy to the county attorney, who I see is standing right there." There is a sound a crowd makes when something has gone off the rails, and it is not a gasp. It is a kind of settling. 70 men shifted their weight at the same time. Bud Galt took it. He was a slow, careful man, and he read the whole thing standing up there. And then he looked at Ivory and said, out loud, because he had to, "This is an affidavit of heirship out of your own deed records, filed the 11th of June, 1910. Ivory said, "It is." And he said, "Sheriff, the woman that affidavit says is dead is standing at the bottom of these steps in a gray coat." I want you to imagine 70 men turning their heads at one time. Vesta Hoyle stood there and let them look at her. She had her hands folded in front of her and her back straight up like a fence post, and she did not look at the ground, and she did not look at my husband. She looked at Judd Ivory, because that is what he had told her to do. He said, "Her name is Vesta Hoyle. She was born in 1891. She was married in Woodward County on the 9th of May, 1907, to that man standing yonder, and there is no decree of divorce in this county or that one, and the clerks of both have certified it, and I have got the certificates in my hand." He said, in the June of 1910, that man swore she was dead of typhoid at Enid, and swore that she had left no child, and on the strength of that paper, he took her father's deeded quarter section into his own name. And it is that quarter section, gentlemen, that this bank is trying to sell you this morning. And then Judd Ivory turned around and said the thing that ended it, and he did not say it loud. He said, "Mr. Renfrew, you cannot sell what he never owned. And if you cry this sale today, every man that bids buys a lawsuit." Otho Renfrew did not move for about 4 seconds. Then he stepped up and had a long, quiet word with the sheriff. And the sheriff said, "The sale on this parcel is continued," and stepped back, and that was the whole of it. There was no gavel. A man said one sentence, and it was over. And that is when my husband came out of the crowd. He came up through those men, and they let him through, and he stopped at the bottom of the steps, and he looked up at Ivory, and then at the sheriff, and then finally at Vesta, for the first time in front of another human being since the March of 1910. And he said to the sheriff, not to her, he said, "That ground has been farmed by me for 25 years. I put the windmill on it in 21. There is not a soul in this county that has ever seen her on it." And Vesta Hoyle said the only sentence she said on those steps that was not her name and 2 dates. She said, "My father dug the first well on it with a bucket, and I held the rope." Nobody said anything at all. Then I went up 2 steps because Ivory had told me where to stand, and I did not stay there. And I turned around and looked at that crowd, at men I had fed at my table at threshing, at women I had sat with in church for 26 years. And I said what I had come 41 miles to say. I said, My name is Alma Suggs. I was told for 26 years that I was Alma Prather, and I was not. And that is not the worst of it. In the July of 1910, this man carried a 9-day-old baby out of a rooming house in Enid in his coat and put him in my arms and told me his cousin had died. And I raised that boy for 25 years and thanked him for it every day. And I said, looking down at him, and I did not raise my voice because there was no need to raise it. I said, "Wendell, you did not bury a wife. You wrote one down as dead and went on eating your supper." They tell me that a man from the Sawyer City paper wrote that line down on the back of an envelope. It was in the paper on the Thursday, and it went in the Guyman paper the week after, and my daughter has got both of them in a scrapbook to this day. Now I will tell you what came of it, and I am going to be honest about the part that is not satisfying. The affidavit was set aside in the spring of '36 in a quiet title suit that Judd Ivory brought in Vesta's name and that nobody defended, because there was nothing to defend it with. The northwest quarter of Section 11 went back into her name 26 years and 10 months after her father put it there. The bank's mortgage on it was worth nothing, because a man cannot mortgage what is not his. And Otho Renfrew had to write off $1,140. And he came out to that place in the April with his hat in his hand and told me he was sorry. And I believed about a third of it. The county attorney, a young man named Dorsey Kell, looked at all of it for 6 weeks. He came out to see me himself in the January and sat in my kitchen and told me that the perjury was 25 years old and there was not a court in Oklahoma that would take it, and that the bigamy, as a crime, ran from the marriage, and that was 26 years gone as well. He said the law had a great deal to say about a man's word on paper, and almost nothing to say about it after the paper had gotten old. That is the only time in this whole business that I put my head down on my own table in front of another person. But Dorsey Kell was a smarter man than he looked. He filed the one thing that was fresh. He filed on my husband for the affidavit he had sworn to in the June of 1910. Only insofar as it was used to defraud the bank in 1928, when he mortgaged that quarter to Renfrew as his own. And that was inside the time, and it was a felony, and in the June of 1936, Wendell Prather pleaded to it and got 18 months at McAllister and served 11. He came out in the May of 1937, and he did not come back to Sawyer County, and I did not see him again until 1940. The home place went. Of course it went. The half section from his father carried its own note, and there was nobody to pay it, and it sold in the December of '36 to a man from Kansas who put it in grass, which is what somebody should have done with it in 19 and 18. I stood in my kitchen and packed 11 boxes and left the wringer washer because it would not go in the truck. And here is the piece of it that I have never known what to do with, and I am going to leave it in your hands. In the July of 1940, I went into Verlin for thread, and there was a line down the side of the store, at the window where the relief was given out, and my husband was in it. He was 56 years old, and he was in another man's coat, and he was standing in a line for commodities with a flour sack folded under his arm, and that man had said, at my own table, for 20 years, that a body that would take relief would take anything. He saw me. We looked at each other for about as long as it takes to read a sentence, and neither one of us said anything. And I went in and bought my thread and came out the other door. That is the mirror. Nobody arranged it. It came around on its own, the way it does. And I would like to be able to tell you that it made me feel something clean, and it did not. It made me feel like a woman standing on a sidewalk holding a spool of thread. He died in Amarillo in the spring of 1943. Loyal went down and saw to it. I did not go, and I have never once been sorry, and I have also never once been able to say that out loud in church. Now the rest of them, because they are the reason I have told you all this. Vesta Hoyle got her 160 acres back, and she never farmed a foot of it. She rented it out to the Nash boys for grass, and she took a house in Verlin, a little frame one behind the Methodist church. And in 1938, she went to the bank at Enid and drew out $60 that had been sitting in her name since 1910. And she gave it to my daughter, and she made her take it, and she said, in my kitchen, with her hands flat on the table, "This is the money he paid to take a child out of a room, and it is going to put a girl through a year of school, or I am going to burn it in the stove." Desi went to the teachers' college at Alva in the September of '38. She taught school in 3 counties for 31 years. She married a man named Curtis Poe, who kept the hardware in Beaver, and she has got 2 girls of her own, and both of them have got a photograph on the wall of a tall woman in a gray coat that they call Grandma Vesta, and neither one of them has ever thought there was one thing strange about that. Loyal did not go back to California. He stayed and he worked, and in the November of '39, he married a girl from Elk City named Fern, and they had 4, and the second one is a boy with a crooked little finger on his left hand that will not lie flat. And when that baby was born, Loyal came out to my house at 11 o'clock at night to tell me about it, and he was laughing and crying at the same time and could not get it out. He called me Mama until the day I buried him, and he called Vesta by her name. And I have thought about that arrangement for 30 years, and I have decided it was the only honest one available to any of us, and that he worked it out himself, at 25, walking on a section road all night in the dark. Vesta and I lived 4 miles apart for 22 years. We were not sisters, and we were not friends the way women are friends who met young. It was something else that has no name that I know. She came at Christmas. I nursed her in 1951 when she had the shingles so bad she could not lift her arm. She died in the September of 1957 in that little house behind the church, and I was in the room, and the last thing she said that anybody could make out was a question about whether the boy had been called. I have got 2 things left to tell, and then I will let you go. In the spring of 1938, after the place had sold and before the new man tore out the porch, I drove out there one Saturday with a putty knife in my pocketbook and let myself in the back door of a house that was not mine anymore. I went into the north room and knelt down behind where the bed had stood and worked that knife under the paint at the baseboard, and I got up a piece about the size of my hand. It was blue. There was a vine in it. It had gone bad along the chimney. I sat down on the floor of that empty room and looked at it for a good while, and what I thought about was not my husband. I thought about a girl of 16 on a ladder in 1907 with a paintbrush, papering a room in a house she believed was going to be hers all her life. The other thing is the Bible. I have got it. Loyal gave it to me in 1937 and said he did not want it in his house, and I have kept it on a shelf in every place I have lived since. In the October of 1938, I sat down at a kitchen table in Verlin with a bottle of ink, and I did what I should have been able to do the whole time, and I did it in my own hand, under the last line, where there was room. I wrote, Loyal Prather, born the 9th day of July, 1910, at Enid, Oklahoma, to Vesta Hoyle. Raised from the 18th day of July, 1910, by Alma Suggs, who did not know and who knows now. My mother used to say, "Write it in the Bible, and it is so." She meant it as a comfort. She meant that a thing set down in that book in ink was fixed and safe and could not be argued with. And that is what I believed for 47 years, and it is not true. A man with a razor and a steady hand can make that book say whatever he wants it to say. And mine did for 25 years on a shelf in my own front room, 3 feet from where I read to my children. But he had to hold that book to do it. He had to sit down at my table with a blade and take out 4 words. And a man who has done that has told you exactly what he is afraid of. And what he was afraid of was a page. I got a page back. It is not the whole of what was taken, and it is not near what I would have chosen. But it is in my hand, and it is in ink, and it is not going to be scraped by anybody, because I am still sitting here in front of it. I wrote it in the Bible, and now it is so. Well, friends, that is where the story leaves us, and I have got one question for you before you go. If you had been standing in my kitchen on the 14th of April, with a wall of dirt coming, and a stranger on your porch asking for work, and you had known, not guessed, known what she had come for, would you have opened that door? Tell me honestly in the comments, and tell me why, because I have never been able to decide, and I am the one who opened it. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. There should be a playlist coming up on your screen with other stories from this channel, and I would love for you to stay a while longer.